Chapter 1. The Violet Envelope Pit was a late summer morning in the village of Lavington Hallows, the sort of morning that seemed made for jam on toast and quiet strolls. The sun glinted off the windows of the vicarage, and the hedgerows were busy with bees. It was the kind of day, one might say, where nothing terribly interesting should happen. Miss Jane Marple, temporarily staying with her niece, Mrs. Gwen Bradbury, was seated under the shade of a chestnut tree, knitting what she claimed would one day become a tea cozy. The pattern had grown unruly and a bit lopsided, though she herself had not noticed. Her attention was not, in fact, on the yarn at all, but on the man across the green. Mr. Cedric Turnwell, the town's solitary insurance clerk and an altogether unremarkable sort, was behaving. Peculiarly. He had exited the Lavington Hallows post office precisely at 10 minutes past 10, as he did every Thursday. But today, in contrast to his usual routine, he did not head for his office above Prowse and Little's general store. Instead, he paused on the step, looked furtively over both shoulders, and then, of all strange things, held a small violet envelope between his fingers and stared at it. Miss Marple, who had watched many people hold letters over the course of her long life, found this particular instance remarkable. He didn't tuck it away or open it. He simply stared. Then he turned left away from the high street and toward the broadleaf copse. That was not his usual route. Not by a margin. Miss Marple, of course, said nothing. She resumed her knitting, even as her eyes drifted from the yarn to the distant outline of Mr. Turnwell's figure, growing smaller as he disappeared among the trees. Later that day, the village square buzzed not about Mr. Turnwell and his curious envelope, but about the upcoming harvest garden competition. Posters had gone up the day before, advertising it in florid lettering. Lady Dervla Gresham's 5th annual harvest garden competition, prizes for best bloom, best arrangement, and most promising young gardener. It's just a show for Lady Dervla to parade about, said Mrs. Ellaby, the butcher's wife, loudly enough for the whole of Langley's grocers to hear. She knows very well that Nellie's the one who grows those roses, not her. Nellie Hayward, Lady Gresham's young under-gardener, was barely 19 and spoke to adults only with downward glances. But she had a prodigious talent for coaxing things out of the earth. Everyone knew it. No one said it aloud. Oh, but she'd never enter, whispered old Mrs. Pritchard, nodding meaningfully. Lady Gresham wouldn't like it. That evening, in the Moor's Lantern, where the beer was tepid and the opinions boiling, Sergeant Tom Berridge was muttering, "Over a half-pint. You'd think it was Parliament being held in that garden," he said. "Flowers and fuss, that's all." "That's what you think," said Mr. Felix Carter, who had once served as the town's station-master and now served as its unofficial source of all confidential news. "You heard about the note?" "What note?" "Lady Gresham got one. Violet envelope. Same as the kind Cedric Turnwell had this morning. Anonymous. Arrived Tuesday. No sender. She burned it, or so she says." Miss Marple, quietly seated in the corner, stirring a cup of very weak tea, looked up for only a moment, then down again. The next morning broke gently. Pale mist clung to the hedges and hung low over the fields. But peace that day would not last long. At 9:15, Mrs. Edith Blackwell, deliverer of warm loaves and village, Opinion discovered something that would crack the shell of Lavington Hallows in two. There, just beyond the gate, two broadleaf copse lying half in shadow beneath the brambles, was Cedric Turnwell. He was flat on his back, his hat at a crooked angle, and his eyes wide open to the sky. No wound, no visible injury, only a faint chemical scent on his breath, and tucked in his jacket pocket, a violet envelope, sealed dot within the hour. Sergeant Berridge was on the scene, flanked by a pale-looking Constable Reeves, and an increasingly gossipy cluster of villagers. The doctor arrived. No immediate cause of death. There would need to be tests. Poison, most likely, Berridge muttered, to no one in particular. Though who on earth would poison him? Suicide offered. Mrs. Ellaby, newly arrived and firmly convinced. I said he was under strain. Insurance men always are. That Job's unnatural. No, no, said Mr. Carter, rubbing his chin with relish. This was planned. You don't walk into the woods to off yourself with your best coat on, unless you're meeting someone. Miss Marple, now at the edge of the cordon, glanced down at the body. She said nothing, but her expression, gentle, composed, and far too calm, suggested that she had already begun to take the full measure of it. Old Dot, there was, after all, something very particular about the way the envelope had been placed. Not dropped, not clutched, but tucked, carefully, deliberately. Back at the vicarage, her niece fussed with the tea things, and muttered about poor Cedric, and the awfulness of it all. It's the strangest thing, Aunt Jane, she said. Everyone's in shock. Said Miss Marple. Do you think it was suicide? I very much doubt it. Her niece paused. But how can you know? I don't, said Miss Marple softly, folding her hands. Not yet. But if a man receives a letter and then dies before speaking a word about it, well, it rather depends who sent the letter, doesn't it? She looked out toward the green, now deserted except for a few pigeons pecking under the bench. Someone in this village, she said, did not want Mr. Turnwell to speak, and they used the oldest method in the book to ensure he wouldn't. And then, with the faintest of smiles, she added, I imagine I shall have to do a bit more knitting near the post office tomorrow. Chapter 2. The village reacts by midday. The news of Cedric Turnwell's death had flowered across Lavington Hallows like spilled ink on blotting paper. It trickled from the post office queue to the hairdresser's chair, whispered its way through the greengrocer's crates of plums and cabbages, and finally arrived with full dramatic flourish at the tables of the Moor's Lantern, where the first of many theories were being brewed over lukewarm tea. Poison, they say, murmured Mrs. Ellaby, stirring her sugar with a kind of mournful relish, though no one knows what kind. Something foreign, perhaps, like in those old novels, arsenic, maybe, or cyanide. That smells of almonds, you know. Oh, yes, said her companion, the ever-watchful Mrs. Tilling, who ran the church jumble, with a near-religious fervor. My cousin in Bexhill once said that if you ever smell bitter almonds, it's a sure sign of trouble, or of a badly baked tart. The pair tittered softly and looked around to ensure their solemnity was intact. At the far end of the pub, Mr. Felix Carter sat with a cigarette burning down unnoticed between his fingers. He had already told the envelope story 3 times that morning, each retelling gathering more interest and less accuracy. In his current version, Mr. Turnwell had fled the post office, as though chased by the devil himself, and the envelope had been glowing violet, like a cursed jewel. Meanwhile, Sergeant Barrage, who found himself both embarrassed and overwhelmed, was attempting to keep order in the face of local hysteria. He stood in front of the baker's window, trying to explain that no arrests had been made and that an official statement would come eventually. "We've sent for someone from the county," he said stiffly, dabbing his forehead with a handkerchief. "They'll be bringing in proper tests and all that." Mrs. Blackwell, who had been present for more deaths than one would expect of a village baker, stood firmly on the other side of the crowd. "I tell you," she said, "he looked peaceful. That's what's strange. You'd think if it was poison there'd be some contortion, some sign, but no. He looked like he'd fallen asleep among the brambles, or like he'd been put there," added someone quietly. Miss Marple, who had taken up a seat at the bus stop with a clean view of the post office, sat knitting with the quiet absorption of someone perfectly idle. But her ears were sharp. Every whispered theory, every shifting expression, every anxious glance, all were quietly filed away. It wasn't the panic she was interested in. It was the fear. She had long learned that the guilty rarely looked nervous in the way people expected. Guilt made people careful, not frantic. It was the innocent, or rather the frightened innocent, who fretted and speculated the most. And sometimes those with a secret to protect that wasn't related to the crime, well, they told their own story with the way they tried to stay out of it. By late afternoon, the town square had settled into a sort of hushed watchfulness. People crossed the green more quickly than usual, and no one lingered near the path to Broadleaf Copse. Vicar Reverend Pembroke delayed ringing the evening bell out of respect, or perhaps uncertainty. Even the sparrows seemed to sing more softly that day. Miss Marple made her way to Prowse and Little's shortly before closing time. Inside, the store smelled of beeswax, string, and the peculiar stale scent of unopened boxes. Behind the counter stood Miss Winifred Little, a thin woman of about 60 with wire spectacles and a curiously sharp way of blinking. "Terrible business," she said the moment Miss Marple stepped in. "I don't know how the village will recover. And with the garden competition this weekend, too." "Yes," said Miss Marple gently. "Poor Mr. Turnwell, such a routine man, wasn't he?" "Painfully so," said Miss Little. "Always paid on the first Monday. Always asked for 2 stamps. Never one. Never spoke unless prompted. That sort of man." "Did you see him yesterday?" Miss Marple asked lightly, as she examined a tin of toffees. "He stopped in just after 9. Bought a roll of carbon paper and a pencil, and he looked pale. Oh, not ill but unsettled, as if he'd had an argument, maybe. Not that he would have told me." Miss Marple nodded. "People rarely tell us what we'd most like to know, don't they?" As she made her purchase and turned to go, she paused. "Funny thing about letters," she said. "Sometimes they cause more trouble unopened than read aloud." Miss Little tilted her head. "You think that envelope had something in it?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that someone in this village very much hoped he wouldn't read it, and now we must wonder who that person might be." She stepped out into the dusk. Across the square, Nellie Hayward, Lady Gresham's shy under-gardener, was crouched over a flower-bed near the church wall, trimming faded petals from the marigolds. She did not look up as Miss Marple passed, but Miss Marple noticed the way her hands trembled. Back at the vicarage, Mrs. Bradbury was brewing tea, and discussing the tragedy with her usual anxiety. "They say the envelope's been taken in as evidence," she said. "It was unopened." "That would explain a great deal," Miss Marple replied quietly. "Explain what?" But Miss Marple merely smiled. "Oh, just a little theory of mine. You see, Gwen, people rarely send anonymous letters unless they are quite sure the recipient will understand without explanation. And when someone goes into the woods with such a letter and doesn't come back well, one begins to wonder who else might have understood it, too." Chapter 3. First suspects. The county inspector arrived the following morning in a dark green motor car that coughed and wheezed up the cobbled lane before finally stalling outside the Lavington Hallows police station. Inspector Ronald Cray, a square-jawed man with a brisk manner and a dislike for local interference, stepped out with polished shoes, a black notebook, and a faint scowl already set across his face by 10 o'clock. He had summoned the first of the villagers to the church hall, where Sergeant Burridge had arranged a small table and 2 wooden chairs under the flickering glow of the overhead bulbs. There was something about the setup too stark, too formal, that immediately made even the most innocent feel faintly culpable. Miss Marple, of course, was not summoned, but she had positioned herself across the green at Mrs. Pritchard's cottage, helping her untangle a ball of knitting yarn that purely by accident gave her an excellent view of those arriving and leaving the hall. The first to be questioned was Miss Winifred Little. "She looked positively affronted," said Mrs. Pritchard, peeking through the lace curtain, "like she was being accused of stealing her own teaspoons." "She does value routine," murmured Miss Marple, "and Mr. Turnwell's death has disturbed the pattern of the village." Next came Nellie Hayward, who appeared at the doorway with red-rimmed eyes and muddy knees. She clutched a straw hat in her hands and didn't look up once as she was led inside. "She knows something," said Mrs. Pritchard. "She's frightened," said Miss Marple quietly. "Not necessarily of guilt." Then came Felix Carter, puffed up like a toad with the importance of being consulted. He emerged half an hour later, dramatically patting his breast pocket and claiming, quite loudly, "I told them what I know. Whether they listen is another matter." By mid-afternoon, the inspector's list of names had grown longer, and Sergeant Burridge looked more worn with each new interview. Still, nothing concrete had come to light. No threats, no witnesses, no sign of struggle. The envelope had been tested. The letter inside was blank. Clean paper. Unmarked. Poison, the coroner had said, most likely ingested voluntarily. Cyanide. Fast-acting. Nearly tasteless if disguised properly. The inspector, hearing this, declared it suicide. Miss Marple disagreed, but she said nothing. Later that day, in the shaded garden behind the vicarage, Miss Marple sat with Gwen and Reverend Pembroke over tea. "Inspector Cray thinks Cedric Turnwell ended his own life," the vicar was saying. "And in truth I can't see why someone would want to harm him. He was dull and precise." Gwen poured more tea. "He had no wife, no close friends. He never caused trouble. If he'd been blackmailed, surely there would be some trace." Miss Marple stirred her tea with an absent rhythm. "Sometimes," she said, "it is precisely those who seem most insignificant who know the wrong sort of secret. And secrets, my dear Gwen, can be deadly currency in a village such as this." The Reverend looked unconvinced. Still, what reason would someone have to send him an anonymous blank letter? Miss Marple looked out toward the distant trees. A blank letter is very much like a mirror. It reflects only what the recipient already knows. That afternoon, Miss Marple took a gentle walk toward the manor grounds, where Lady Dervla Gresham was hosting an informal tea under the ivy-covered veranda for the local gardening committee. It was, Miss Marple knew, as much an exhibition of dominance as it was a social gesture. Lady Dervla, who was tall, silver-haired, and dressed in cream, as though perpetually prepared for photographs, greeted her with exaggerated delight. "My dear Miss Marple, I heard you were visiting. So lovely to have you among us. I do hope the scandal hasn't unsettled you too badly." "I find it rather curious, actually," said Miss Marple gently. "Poor Mr. Turnwell, he seemed such a dependable man." "Oh, he was," said Lady Dervla, waving her hand. "Always paid his insurance on time, always polite. Rather too colorless, if you ask me. One can't be surprised at such people occasionally. How shall I put it, collapse under the grayness of it all." Miss Marple's smile never wavered. "You received an anonymous letter as well, I hear." Lady Dervla blinked, just for a moment. "A nasty little thing," she said, too quickly. "Anonymous, unsigned, I burned it immediately." "And you didn't think to inform the inspector?" "There was nothing in it," she said, with an airy shrug. "Just paper. I assumed it was some child's idea of a joke." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Violet envelope?" Lady Dervla's fingers tightened around her teacup, ever so slightly. "I believe so, yes." Miss Marple, satisfied, thanked her for the tea and left soon after. As she walked back through the village, she passed Nellie Hayward tending the flower beds near the edge of the manor lawn. The girl kept her eyes down, her hands moving with careful precision. Miss Marple stopped. "Your zinnias are doing beautifully," she said softly. Nellie looked up, startled. "Thank you, miss. You knew Mr. Turnwell, I imagine?" Nellie hesitated. He asked me about the competition last week. Said he'd heard someone might be entering under my name. But I told him I wouldn't. I'm not allowed." "Not allowed?" Nellie flushed and turned back to the flowers. "Lady Gresham wouldn't like it." Miss Marple studied the girl for a moment. "Did he say who told him that?" "No, miss." "And you didn't think it odd?" Nellie shook her head. But Miss Marple did. Something had shifted in the soil of this quiet village. Something rooted deep, far deeper than any of them wanted to admit. Chapter 4. A hidden clue the next morning dawned pale and watchful, with clouds hanging low like villagers reluctant to gossip in full voice. The church bell rang a touch late, its chime muffled by the damp. Miss Marple, as was her habit when something was troubling her mind, took her tea at the kitchen table long before Gwen rose. The letter had been blank. That much the police had confirmed. But to Miss Marple, that was the most revealing detail of all. At 10 o'clock sharp, she stepped out with her wicker basket, claiming she needed embroidery floss from Prowse and Little's. In truth, she had no particular project in mind, but she had observed over many years and many deaths that useful bits of information were often wrapped in ordinary errands. Inside the shop, Miss Little was rearranging a row of sewing needles behind the counter. She nodded sharply. "Terrible weather," she said, though her glance suggested that she, like everyone else, believed the weather was a poor excuse for the cold fog clinging to the village scents. Mr. Turnwell's death. Miss Marple smiled politely. Gray days often bring things to the surface, I find. As Miss Little wrapped the floss, Miss Marple ventured. You mentioned the other day that Mr. Turnwell had purchased carbon paper and a pencil. Did he buy those things often? Never before, said Miss Little. Which struck me. You? No, he always typed. One of those old clacking machines. Lived very methodically. But on Tuesday he came in and asked for a pencil and a sheet of carbon paper. Odd request. Very, Miss Marple murmured. He didn't say what for. Didn't offer, and I didn't ask. Though I did wonder. People don't often write by hand anymore. Certainly not him. Miss Marple left shortly after, tucking that small detail away. She didn't know the whole picture yet, but the pieces were beginning to gather. Later that morning, she visited the police station with a tin of lemon biscuits. Gwen's recipe, she claimed as a subtle excuse to speak with Sergeant Berridge. The young constable let her in with an embarrassed smile, clearly unsure whether to treat her as a guest or a suspect. Sergeant Berridge, seated at a small desk surrounded by files and the scent of cheap polish, looked up with tired eyes. Miss Marple, what brings you here? Oh, just these, she said, setting down the tin. And a small question, if I may. He raised an eyebrow. That envelope Mr. Turnwell had, she said softly. It was blank inside, I understand, but I wonder, was it entirely blank? He frowned. Far as I know, the inspector had it. Tested. Nothing on it. No pressure marks? She asked. No imprint on the paper, perhaps? Berridge looked confused. You mean like indentations? Yes. Sometimes when people write something and tear the top sheet away, the impression remains faintly beneath. He blinked, then opened a drawer, rummaging through its contents. After a moment, he retrieved a plastic sleeve. Well, I didn't think of that, he admitted. But now that you mention it, he slid the sheet out. The envelope was still there, violet and faintly creased. The single folded sheet inside looked pristine until one tilted it slightly beneath the desk lamp. There, barely visible but unmistakable, was a faint outline of words, not enough to read, but enough to prove they had once existed. Berridge gave a low whistle. I'll be someone wrote a letter, then they erased it, or replaced it. Miss Marple leaned in. Might I suggest you look at the carbon paper he purchased on Tuesday? He blinked. You think he made a copy? I think he might have, said Miss Marple. People who work in insurance understand the value of documentation. Berridge stood. Right, I'll have them check the flat again. No need, said Miss Marple gently. May I hazard a guess? The copy won't be found at his residence. He knew someone might search it. But I rather expect he hid it. Where? Well, she smiled, where do men keep important things they mustn't forget? Near where they walk, but not too visible. Somewhere ordinary, perhaps in the lining of a coat, or more interestingly sewn into a gardening glove. The sergeant stared at her. How on earth? I once knew a man in St. Mary Mead who used to hide his money in a gardening glove stitched inside out. People are much the same everywhere. Later that day, as a constable quietly searched Mr. Turnwell's personal effects again, a single glove of cracked brown leather was unstitched at the cuff. Inside, folded neatly in fourths, was a smudged sheet of carbon paper dot, and upon it, barely legible, were the pressed words of a letter. The top half had faded, but the closing lines were clear. If this comes to light, she'll lose everything. But that's what she deserves. I won't stay quiet any more. Not after what happened to Father. No signature, no name, but it was something. And to Miss Marple it was everything. Back at the vicarage, Gwen was darning a pair of socks by the fire when her aunt returned. "You've been gone nearly all day," she said. "Surely you're not solving the case yourself, Aunt Jane?" Miss Marple removed her gloves and folded them delicately. "My dear Gwen, I'm simply curious. Curious as to who she is, and what she did to Mr. Turnwell's father, and why someone thought it best to ensure silence. But how can you be certain it wasn't suicide?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Because people who plan to end their lives rarely take such care in hiding their words." Chapter 5. Confrontations and Secrets. The discovery of the carbon copy rattled the calm facade of Lavington Hallows. Sergeant Berridge, emboldened by the breakthrough, passed the finding to Inspector Cray, who dismissed it with a grunt and a wave of his hand. "Half a letter and a vague threat," Cray said. "Could mean anything. Likely just a final emotional vent before the man offed himself. The father probably left a poor inheritance or a secret mistress." But Miss Marple thought otherwise. She had observed that when someone mentions losing everything, it usually refers not to money, but to reputation, and in villages such as this, reputation was worth far more than currency dot on Thursday. Afternoon, Lady Dervla Gresham's polished green Bentley appeared in the square, drawing eyes, as it always did. She stepped out near the chemist's, wearing a mauve silk scarf and an expression too composed to be natural. She made her way directly to the police station, staying no longer than 10 minutes, and then walked back briskly to her car with her. Gloves pulled tight and her mouth set thin dot by tea time. Half the village knew she'd gone to clarify something. The other half assumed she had gone to confess. Miss Marple heard of the visit through Mrs. Blackwell, who stopped by the vicarage to deliver fresh buns and 3 new theories. "Well, I shouldn't say it, but there's talk, Miss Marple." "Old talk. You remember Lady Gresham's husband? The late Lord Simon?" "Yes," said Miss Marple mildly. "Died some 10 years ago, I believe. Riding accident?" "Ma'am," Mrs. Blackwell sniffed. "That's what they said. Fell from his mare out near the quarry. But word always had it that the mare never spooked, and that Lord Simon was a careful rider. And what connection might that have to poor Mr. Turnwell?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Blackwell pursed her lips. "His father used to be Lord Simon's estate accountant. Retired suddenly. Moved to Wiltshire, and passed within the year. Heart failure, they said, but Cedric stayed behind." "How curious," Miss Marple murmured. "And that's not all," Mrs. Blackwell whispered, leaning in. "Word is Lady Gresham made a private endowment to Cedric Turnwell last year, through the bank, quietly. Not a lot, but enough to notice if one was watching." That detail, Miss Marple thought, lined up rather nicely with the contents of the letter. A bribe to ensure silence, or guilt? Either way, the threads were beginning to knot. She paid a visit to Lady Gresham's manor the next morning under the pretense of delivering a plant cutting from the vicarage greenhouse. The butler, hesitant at first, let her in when Lady Gresham herself heard Miss Marple's name. They sat in the drawing-room, or pale sunlight streaked across the waxed floors. Lady Gresham poured the tea herself, her movements crisp and elegant, though there was a faint tightness around her eyes that no powder could conceal. "I imagine you've come to ask questions," she said. "Not UNKINDLY. Miss Marple gave a small smile. "I came to see how you're coping, Lady Gresham. I understand you knew Mr. Turnwell rather well." "We were acquainted," she said, "in the way one is with village functionaries. He once worked under your husband's estate accountant, I believe?" Lady Gresham paused. "Yes, long ago." Miss Marple folded her hands gently. "It's just his letter suggested he knew something damaging about someone, and that he meant to bring it to light. You were mentioned in speculation, of course. The letter spoke of someone losing everything, a woman." Lady Gresham's hand twitched slightly as she placed the teacup down. "Gossip," she said. "That is all. His father, Mr. Turnwell, Sr., was dismissed from our service after a misunderstanding, mismanaged funds. He was not prosecuted, but it was a quiet exit. Cedric never forgave me. Believes I was responsible." "And were you?" Lady Gresham hesitated. "I trusted my late husband's judgment." Miss Marple let the silence stretch just enough to suggest that the answer hadn't quite satisfied her. Then, with careful neutrality, she said, "You burned the letter you received, didn't you?" "I did." "Was it also blank?" Lady Gresham looked up surprised. "No. Mine said only 3 words. You are next." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened just slightly. "And you didn't think it necessary to mention that before now?" "I thought it nonsense," Lady Gresham said, her voice suddenly brittle. "A joke, a threat from someone with a grudge. I didn't imagine he'd actually die." "No," said Miss Marple softly, "but someone else did." She stood, setting down her teacup. "Thank you for your time, Lady Gresham. I do hope the garden competition continues as planned." As she left, Miss Marple caught sight of Nellie Hayward, raking gravel near the side path. She approached, walking slowly enough not to startle. "Nellie," she said gently, "do you remember Mr. Turnwell visiting you in the garden?" The girl nodded. "He asked me why I wasn't entering the competition. Said someone might try to enter on my behalf without asking. I told him I didn't want to cause trouble." Miss Marple considered this. "And did you notice anything odd around that time? Anything out of place?" Nellie hesitated. There was a glove, one of Lady Gresham's. It turned up in the potting shed. Looked clean, but smelled funny, like nail varnish remover, only stronger. Miss Marple's breath caught for a moment. "And where is it now?" I gave it to cook. She burns anything odd. Said it could be dangerous." Miss Marple thanked her and walked back toward the vicarage in thoughtful silence. Nail varnish remover. Acetone. Common enough in a lady's cabinet, but also a chemical cousin to cyanide compounds. It was a clue, not a proof, but it carried the unmistakable scent of careful planning. Someone in Lavington. Hallows had used poison. And Miss Marple now believed it had not been meant for Cedric Turnwell alone. Chapter 6. Another twist by the time Sunday arrived. The clouds had thinned into strips of gauze across the sky, and the village prepared, somewhat reluctantly, for the annual harvest garden competition at Gresham Manor. Despite Mr. Turnwell's untimely death, Lady Dervla insisted the event proceed. As planned, citing the need for normality and community spirit in times of distress, the villagers, while uneasy, complied. After all, gossip traveled more freely in public, and few could resist the lure of floral displays paired with whispered speculation. Beneath garlands of chrysanthemums and the quiet hum of bees, tension bloomed just as thickly as the roses. Miss Marple arrived precisely at 2:00, dressed in a dove-gray dress, with a modest brooch and her ever-present parasol. She strolled the rows of floral exhibits without comment, her eyes quietly observing more than just petals and stems. Nellie Hayward's arrangement entered anonymously by an enthusiastic admirer. According to the event, program drew murmurs of praise. It featured blood-red dahlias and pale white bellflowers arranged in a near-perfect spiral. Yet Nellie stood far behind the crowd, her hands clasped tightly, her expression unreadable. Lady Dervla floated among the guests like a ship in full sail, graceful and immaculate. If the threat had rattled her, she did not show it. She smiled, she judged, and she posed for a photograph near her prized roses. Her only deviation from poise was the fact that she never once left her glass of elderflower. Cordial, unattended. Miss Marple took note. She also noted that Felix Carter, once merely chatty, had become oddly evasive. He hovered near the refreshment tent, his conversation less eager, his eyes flicking often toward the manor's east wing windows. And then, just after the final judging, as Lady Gresham rose to announce the winners, there was a sudden commotion. By the hedge maze, a cry, a rustling. Then shouting. Sergeant Burridge was the first to run. Miss Marple followed, slower but not far behind. Several villagers crowded near the maze's edge as Burridge parted the hedges and emerged gripping the arm of a flushed and trembling man. It was Walter Sims, the postmaster. In his hand, half crumpled and spotted with mud, was another violet. Envelope. I wasn't stealing it, he said immediately, before anyone had accused him of anything. I was hiding it. Well, not hiding, just removing it before anyone else found it. I didn't want trouble. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Another envelope? Walter looked at her helplessly, then at Burridge. It was behind the sundial. I saw it tucked there yesterday. Thought it was a mistake at first. Then I remembered the color. Burridge took the envelope carefully. Unopened? Walter shook his head. I couldn't help myself. I opened it this morning, and it said, "You'll be next." Just like Turnwell. Poison fits cowards. A hush fell over the crowd. Miss Marple stepped closer. Did you touch it much? Walter blinked. Only the edges, I think. I was careful. Even so, said Miss Marple, I suggest you let the inspector have it, and perhaps have your hands examined. It may have been treated with something unpleasant. Walter blanched. You think someone meant to poison the letter? I think, said Miss Marple, that someone wanted it to appear that way. But if true poison had been involved, Mr. Sims would already be unconscious. Burridge, flustered but trying to assert control, ordered the crowd to disperse. The envelope was taken inside, sealed in a plastic sleeve. Inspector Cray, summoned once more from the county, arrived by late afternoon. Looking sour and tired, Miss Marple requested a brief word. In my experience, she told him, a poisoner often relies more on suggestion than substance. A person can die from fear under the right pressure. But in this case, we have something more structured, someone with access, opportunity, and a reason to spread fear as a smokescreen. Cray folded his arms. Are you suggesting these threats are a performance? Partly, Miss Marple said. But more importantly, they are selective. Cedric Turnwell received one. Lady Gresham received one. And now a third appears, this time in public, where anyone might find it. That is not escalation. That is misdirection. That evening, back at the vicarage, Gwen was pacing. It's gone from strange to dreadful, she said. I knew Walter as a boy. He cried when his bicycle chain broke. He wouldn't poison a wasp, let alone a man. Miss Marple, seated with her tea, considered her next words carefully. Gwen, she said, do you recall what Cedric Turnwell's letter said? She'll lose everything, but he never said who she was. You think it wasn't Lady Gresham? I think it was meant to seem so, Miss Marple replied. But there is another woman in this village who had much to lose. And no one is looking at her. Gwen frowned. Who? Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she stood, walked to the bureau, and retrieved the event program from the garden competition dot. She tapped gently on the anonymous entry. Nellie's arrangement, she said, was entered by an admirer, but we've only heard of one person who asked her about entering Turnwell. Gwen's eyes widened. You think he submitted it under her name? I think he suspected that someone might try to take credit for Nellie's work or suppress it, and he wanted to ensure she had her moment. Gwen stared. But what does that have to do with the murder? Miss Marple turned back to the firelight, her voice very quiet, because if someone stood to be embarrassed publicly, socially, by Nellie's success, they might have considered silence worth killing for. Outside, the wind stirred faintly through the hedges, and somewhere in the village, Miss Marple knew, a fourth letter might already be waiting. Chapter 7. Miss Marple's Final Test. The morning. After the garden competition, Lavington Hallows was unusually subdued. No bells rang from the church tower, and the post office remained shuttered with a hastily written sign, closed until further notice. The envelope discovered behind the sundial had cast a long shadow. Even the village children, normally so eager to race across the green, played quietly under the oaks, as if afraid to step too loudly. At the vicarage, Gwen read aloud the latest column from the Lavington Herald, which reported on Mr. Turnwell's death with a mix of caution and conjecture. The article ended by praising Lady Gresham's commendable poise in preserving village traditions, though it omitted any mention of the anonymous threats. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had spent the early hours in her bedroom, rifling through a notebook in which she kept her thoughts discreetly, without names or dates, but with precision. Now, as the clock struck 10, she descended the stairs with the calm of someone who had made up her mind. She asked Gwen for a small favor. Would you be a dear and invite Miss Nellie Hayward to tea this afternoon? Nothing formal, just a quiet chat. I believe she might be in need of a listener. Gwen raised an eyebrow. You think she knows something? I think, Miss Marple said delicately, that someone's silence has been mistaken for guilt, and that Nellie may have seen more than she realizes. That afternoon, Nellie arrived at the vicarage in a modest navy skirt and a cardigan with a missing button. She sat at the edge of her chair, her hands folded in her lap so tightly that her knuckles blanched. Gwen poured the tea, making gentle chatter about roses and begonias, while Miss Marple waited quietly, patiently until the moment arrived. "Miss Hayward," she said kindly, "do you remember when you first saw Mr. Turnwell in the Manor Gardens?" Nellie blinked, startled. "Yes, miss. He asked you about the competition." "Yes, he said someone might try to enter under my name without my say-so." "And did anyone?" Nellie hesitated. "I don't know, miss. I never filled out the form. But when I saw the entry list, I thought it was his doing. He wanted me to be seen. Was that a good thing?" Nellie looked down. "It would have been. But Lady Gresham doesn't like that sort of attention. She said the help should stay in the background. She didn't shout, but she looked at me as if I'd betrayed her." Miss Marple gave a slight nod. "Tell me, did she ever threaten you?" "No," Nellie said. Then, quietly, "But she warned me. She said I'd be sorry if I let ambition get in the way of loyalty." Miss Marple gently changed tack. "And did she ever mention Mr. Turnwell?" Another pause. "Only once. After he came to see me, she asked what he wanted. When I told her, she just smiled and said, 'Men like him always end up talking too much.'" Miss Marple offered Nellie another biscuit, but her mind had moved on. After Nellie left, she sat quietly, thinking. The truth was nearly complete, but she still needed a final proof, something beyond inference, something personal. That evening, under the veil of dusk, she paid an unannounced visit to Lady Gresham. The butler hesitated, but when Miss Marple insisted it was a private, urgent matter, she was shown in. Lady Gresham met her in the library, dressed in muted satin and holding a crystal glass of white wine. Her expression was wary but not hostile. "To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure?" Miss Marple smiled thinly. "I won't stay long, Lady Gresham. I merely wished to return something." She reached into her handbag and produced a familiar violet envelope. Lady Gresham stiffened. "Where did you?" "It's not one of yours," Miss Marple said calmly. "It's one I created myself. An imitation, nothing more. No threat. Inside, just an observation. A final test, you might say." She handed it to Lady Gresham, who took it reluctantly. Her hands were steady, but her face betrayed the faintest trace of alarm. "You see," Miss Marple continued, "I left it this afternoon near your conservatory, just tucked behind a pot of geraniums. I wanted to see what you'd do." Lady Gresham's lips parted. "That's absurd. You planted it?" "I did," Miss Marple replied softly, and within 15 minutes it had vanished, taken quietly without a word to staff or police. "You didn't destroy it, you brought it here." "That was clever, but not quite clever enough." Lady Gresham took a step back. "You're accusing me of what? Playing games with stationery?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple said gently, "that you've been sending the violet envelopes to deflect attention. That Mr. Turnwell's death was not a suicide, nor a warning from some shadowy villain. It was your doing, because he threatened to expose the truth about your late husband." Lady Gresham's face changed just slightly. A flicker of coldness passed across it, a momentary absence of performance. "Lord Simon," Miss Marple said, "was not the gentleman the village believed him to be. He had debts, he falsified records, and his accountant, Mr. Turnwell's father, discovered this." Lady Gresham said nothing. Rather than risk scandal, you paid Cedric a small pension to keep quiet. But when he threatened to reveal the truth, perhaps for Nellie's sake, you acted. Poisoned elderflower cordial. Just a few drops. Enough to end his life discreetly. Lady Gresham's grip on the glass tightened. You have no evidence. No, Miss Marple agreed. But I have something better. I have your fear. Fear. I wouldn't have dared otherwise. Yours with gratitude. Nellie H. Gwen folded the note slowly. She's leaving. She's beginning, Miss Marple corrected. There's a difference. That evening, as the sun dropped low and painted the rooftops with amber light, Miss Marple took one last walk to the edge of broadleaf copse. The brambles had been trimmed back since the police search, but the scent of wild mint still hung in the air. She stood for a moment at the spot where Cedric Turnwell had fallen, where silence had once hidden something too heavy for one man to carry. The leaves whispered around her, and she closed her eyes. He had not been a remarkable man, not in the way most people would measure, but he had acted with quiet courage, and he had written the truth, if not with ink, then with his final choices. She turned and walked back toward the village, the sky now deepening into twilight, the first stars pricking the blue dot in a place like Lavington Hallows. Evil came dressed in manners and rhododendrons. But justice, too, had its disguises, and sometimes it wore a cardigan and carried knitting needles. Chapter 10. The Final Reflection. It was nearly a week after the garden competition that Lavington Hallows returned, if not to normal, then to something resembling peace. The village square once again echoed with the chime of bicycles and the clipped greetings of neighbors. At the vicarage, spring onions sprouted neatly in the kitchen garden, and Mrs. Gwen Bradbury was preparing gooseberry jam with admirable determination, even as she kept glancing toward the drawing-room, where her aunt sat calmly by the window, knitting needles clicking gently. Miss Marple had always believed that after a death, especially a violent one, there must come a moment of stillness, not just for mourning, but for understanding. That moment had now arrived. Gwen entered with 2 cups of tea and a quiet sigh. It's still hard to believe, she said, handing 1 cup to her aunt, that someone like Lady Gresham could well do something so horrid, and for something so petty. Miss Marple tilted her head, her needles pausing. It wasn't petty to her, she said softly. Pride rarely is. You see, Gwen, Lady Gresham had constructed her entire life like a mosaic, every piece precisely in place. Husband, manner, Rose's reputation. When Cedric Turnwell threatened to dislodge even 1 corner of that, it wasn't just a secret he endangered. It was her identity. But poisoning, Gwen shook her head. It's so extreme. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, but not impulsive. She planned it quietly, methodically. A private meeting, an untraceable cordial, and a sealed envelope. To misdirect suspicion, it was elegant in its cruelty. Gwen looked down at her lap. Do you think Cedric knew he was walking into a trap? I think he hoped, perhaps foolishly, that appealing to her sense of decency might work, that by confronting her with the truth he could make her relent. He underestimated her fear of exposure. Miss Marple reached for a thread of yarn and looped it with precision. He was brave, Gwen, in his own way. He tried to protect Nellie. He wanted the village to see her not as a servant, but as someone with talent and worth. Gwen smiled faintly. She's already planning her move to Devon, you know. Wrote again this morning. She said she's looking forward to learning. Things that aren't whispered through hedges. A wise ambition. Miss Marple murmured. There was a knock at the door just then. Gwen rose to answer it and returned a moment later with Sergeant Berridge, hat in hand and cheeks a little flushed. "Good afternoon, ladies," he said. "Hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," Miss Marple replied warmly. "Do sit down. Would you like tea?" "Oh, no, thank you. Just came to bring something. We've completed the case file. Inspector Cray asked me to pass along our gratitude." He handed over a brown envelope, which Miss Marple accepted with a smile. "I dare say you could teach the constabulary a thing or two," Berridge said, shifting slightly in his chair. "You were right about everything. The cordial, the second, bottle, the motive. I was merely paying attention," she said. "People always reveal themselves, if not in words, then in what they avoid saying." Berridge chuckled. "Still, I'll be double-checking every glass of cordial from now on." He rose, tipped his cap, and excused himself. After the door closed, Gwen glanced at the unopened envelope. "Are you going to read it?" "No," said Miss Marple, setting it aside. "I know what it contains, and more importantly, what it doesn't. Some things are better left settled." The rest of the day passed in gentle quiet. The sun drifted low, casting gold across the rooftops. In the distance a dog barked, a bicycle bell rang, and the sound of a lawn-mower hummed behind a hedge. All the familiar comforts of village life resumed their rhythm. As twilight settled, Miss Marple stepped into the garden with a shawl wrapped over her shoulders. She walked to the bench beneath the pear tree and sat down, letting her thoughts settle with the scent of lavender and old wood smoke. The case had come to its end, but the questions it raised still lingered. Not about guilt, it was clear, but about the fragility of the masks people wore, how easily they cracked under pressure, how quickly a life of dignity could turn to desperation when threatened by truth. She thought of Cedric Turnwell, of the way he had held the violet envelope, not with fear, but with resolve. A man without charisma, without power, but not without conscience, and Nellie so often invisible, who now stood on the cusp of a new life, one built not on someone else's approval, but on her own merit. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly and listened to the stillness. She did not long for excitement. She had never sought out crime or chaos, but she did believe firmly that wrong must be seen, and once seen, gently but firmly corrected, whether it took a quart or a cup of tea to do it. Above her, a single star appeared in the fading sky. And with a quiet smile, Miss Marple rose from the bench, turned back toward the warm light of the vicarage window, and went inside. Tomorrow, no doubt, would bring gossip about hedgerows and seed catalogues, but tonight justice had bloomed. Epilogue, the quiet watcher autumn, arrived gently in Lavington Hallows. The leaves turned amber along the church path, and the air grew crisp with the scent of turned soil and chimney smoke. Summer's noise had given way to the hush of preparation. The garden beds cleared, the windows sealed, and the gossip, for once, softened to something resembling reflection. The manor remained closed. No word had come from Lady Gresham since her removal to a quiet estate in the north, where, as Felix Carter claimed with authority, ladies of a certain standing go when scandal has eaten through the drapery. The grounds had been left to ivy and memory. The roses, once trimmed into flawless spirals, now bloomed in wild disorder, untouched and perhaps more honest for it. Nellie Hayward left Lavington quietly, with 2 small suitcases and a stiff, new coat gifted by the vicar's wife. She did not host goodbyes or ask for promises. But before she boarded the coach to Devon, she stopped once more by the vicarage to leave behind a potted cutting of a rare lily blood red, star-shaped and delicately blooming despite the cold. For Miss Marple, she told Gwen, to remember that some things grow stronger after they're nearly uprooted. Miss Marple kept the lily on her window-sill. She watered it sparingly, and in the quiet moments of her day she would sometimes glance at it, not with sentimentality, but with the calm satisfaction of a woman who had seen something unpleasant, brought into the light, and then gently, firmly, put right. Gwen resumed her usual schedule of baking and community letters, though with a newfound attentiveness. She no longer dismissed odd behavior or brushed away silences with polite distraction. She had learned through her aunt's example that evil rarely arrived with thunder. It crept, it disguised, and it counted on no one watching closely. But someone always was. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the church steeple, and the last of the leaves drifted onto the green, Gwen asked her aunt, "Will it happen again, do you think? Something dreadful like this?" Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "Oh, yes," she said without malice. "Not here, necessarily, but somewhere. As long as there are secrets and pride, and the desire to keep one's name spotless, there will be lies. And where there are lies, there's usually something dark underneath." Gwen shivered slightly, drawing her cardigan tighter. "But there will also be people who notice," Miss Marple added gently. "People who ask small questions, who remember small things. That's the comfort." She picked up her tea, besides. She said, smiling faintly, "It's the ones who think no one's watching who tend to make the most revealing mistakes." And with that, they sat in silence, the kind shared by those who understood what it meant to quietly guard the peace. Outside, the first frost touched the grass dot, and inside the quiet watcher resumed her knitting.